The sun rose slowly over the lush green fields of the small village of Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender. Rachel was pulling a bucket from the well, her eyes drifting to Elias in the distance as he worked on the worn wooden plow, weathered from years of toil. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and eyes that usually gleamed with determination but seemed more distant than usual that morning. She knew what that meant. Elias had been restless for weeks. Conversations at the church and the market had been dominated by tales of fertile lands out west, where rolling hills promised prosperity to those brave enough to claim it. Many friends had already left, and now it seemed Elias wanted the same. When he returned home that evening, Rachel found him on the porch, gazing out at the fields they called home. A gentle breeze rustled the golden stalks of grain, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavy. "Rachel, I need to talk to you," Elias began, his voice hesitant. She sat beside him, resting her hand on his strong arm. "It's about the West, isn't it?" she asked softly. He let out a deep sigh, as if bearing the weight of the world. "Yes. God's put it on my heart. I know we have everything here, but I feel there's something greater waiting for us out there. We could build something for our family, for our future." Rachel felt a pang in her chest. She was 3 months pregnant and already overwhelmed by the changes happening in her life. Leaving her home, her mother, and the women of the community seemed unthinkable. "What if we're wrong, Elias? What if it's just a dream?" she asked, her voice trembling. He took her hands in his eyes locked on hers. "It's not just a dream. It's faith. I know it's risky, but God never called us to safety, Rachel. He called us to obedience." Those words stayed with her through the night, as the baby inside her seemed to stir more than usual. She thought of Mary and Joseph, traveling to Bethlehem with no certainty about what lay ahead. She thought about the courage it took to say yes to God. The next morning, she found Elias at the foot of the bed, his Bible open, tears glistening in his eyes. "Rachel, read this with me," he said, pointing to an underlined verse. It was Joshua 1 verse 9, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." She took a deep breath and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Let's go west, Elias. But only if we go together in prayer, trusting that he'll be with us." That afternoon, they shared their decision with family and the community. The evening church service was filled with tears and goodbyes. The pastor prayed for protection and provision, and each member of the congregation came forward to embrace the young couple, offering small gifts for the journey: a handmade quilt, dry bread, a lantern. At the end of the service, Rachel's mother held her tightly. "Remember, my daughter, God will be with you, but never forget, He's here too." Rachel nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The next morning, with the wagon loaded and the horses ready, Elias took her hand as they took their first step into the unknown. And so, with hearts full of faith and a mix of fear and hope, their journey began. The creaking of wooden wheels against the dirt trail became the soundtrack of Rachel and Elias's new life. The wagon was packed tightly with provisions, tools, and a few mementos from the home they had left behind. Each mile they traveled felt like a silent goodbye to everything they had ever known. On the first day, Rachel spent hours watching the landscape slowly shift from green fields to gentle hills. The sun scorched her skin as she held the reins of the horse alongside Elias, who walked in silence, his eyes always on the path ahead. Every so often, he glanced at her, as if to reassure himself that they were doing all right. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked that evening as they stopped by a creek to rest. Rachel shook her head, her fingers lightly gripping the small wooden cross around her neck. "Not second thoughts. Just fear. It feels like we left behind more than just our belongings. Like we left a part of ourselves." Elias nodded, understanding. Maybe that's how God teaches us to trust him more. That night, as the campfire cast dancing shadows against the nearby trees, Elias opened the Bible and read aloud. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Proverbs 3 verses 5-6. Rachel watched him as he read, the firelight highlighting his tired but resolute face. In that moment, surrounded by the unknown, she felt a flicker of peace. The days that followed brought new challenges. The trail, once well-defined, grew narrow and rocky, making it harder for the wagon to pass. The midday heat turned every task into a struggle, and though their water supply was sufficient, it had to be rationed carefully. Rachel began to feel the weight of her pregnancy more intensely. One evening, as she helped Elias unload the wagon, a sharp pain in her abdomen made her stop and hold her belly. Elias rushed to her side, alarmed. "You need to rest, Rachel. You can't push yourself so hard. And you can't do everything alone," she replied with a stubborn smile. Despite the hardships, there were moments of beauty that strengthened their spirits. One morning, as the sun rose, they came upon a vast plain covered in golden wildflowers swaying in the breeze like a shimmering ocean. Rachel stepped down from the wagon, her fingers brushing against the petals. "Elias, look at this. It's like a glimpse of heaven." He walked up to her, gently pulling her into an embrace. "This is what we're heading for, Rachel. To find places like this and call them home." That same day, as they crossed a small hill, they saw a group of wagons stopped in the distance. When they drew closer, they realized it was a family in trouble. One of their wagon wheels had broken, and their horses were exhausted. Elias didn't hesitate. He halted their wagon and went to offer help. The family's father, a stern-looking man named Jonathan, gave a curt nod of thanks, but it was his wife, Grace, who truly expressed her gratitude. "God bless you for this," Grace said, clasping Rachel's hand as they spoke. The repairs took hours, but during that time, Rachel learned that Grace was also expecting, only a few weeks behind her. The two women shared stories of their families, and Rachel felt relief in confiding her fears and anxieties with someone who understood. When it was time to part ways, Jonathan handed Elias a small sack of grain as a token of thanks. "It's not much, but it might come in handy," he said, almost sheepishly. Elias accepted it with a warm smile. What comes from God's hands is always enough. As the sun set, Rachel and Elias resumed their journey, their hearts reassured that even in the struggles, they were not alone. The road was long, but the purpose guiding them shone brighter with each passing day. The deep blue sky signaled the start of another day on the journey. The wagon pressed on steadily, but each new stretch of the trail brought fresh challenges. The terrain grew rougher, and Elias often had to dismount to guide the horses through narrow paths. Rachel felt the exhaustion in her body, but her resolve remained firm. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind distant mountains, they spotted a group of wagons gathered around a campfire. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasting meat brought an unexpected comfort to Rachel's weary heart. Elias decided it would be safe to camp nearby for the night. As they approached, they were greeted by an elderly man with a long beard and a welcoming smile. "Welcome, travelers," he said. "I'm Caleb, and this is my family. Fellow pioneers, like yourselves. Come, share the fire." Rachel and Elias gratefully accepted the invitation. Around the fire, Caleb introduced his companions, his wife, Esther, and their two teenage grandchildren. Other travelers had also joined the caravan, including a reserved but amicable merchant named Silas. "And where are you headed?" Caleb asked, passing a piece of warm bread to Elias. Elias smiled, resting a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "We're searching for fertile land to build a home." Caleb nodded with understanding. That's a noble pursuit. God has plans for each of us, though the road to them is often full of stones. That evening was filled with stories. Around the fire, the travelers shared their journeys. Silas recounted his trading adventures in small towns across the West. Esther spoke of how she had left everything behind in her youth, trusting in the promise of a brighter future. Rachel listened intently, the open Bible resting in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, but Elias's encouraging gaze gave her courage. I was afraid of this journey, she admitted. Leaving our home and family was the hardest decision I've ever made. But I know God called us to this. And even though I'm scared, we're trying to obey. Rachel's simple words resonated with the group. Caleb smiled warmly. The Lord doesn't choose the brave. He gives courage to those he chooses. After the evening's final prayer, Elias lingered by the fire, speaking with Silas. Rachel, already lying in the wagon, watched the fire's flickering light against the starry sky. Something about Silas intrigued her. He seemed to know these lands well, yet there was a shroud of mystery around his story. The next morning, the caravan prepared to move on. Caleb and his family were taking a different route, but not before leaving Elias and Rachel with a gift, a pouch of medicinal herbs and a small jar of honey. We don't know what lies ahead, but there's always something sweet to be found along the journey, Esther said, placing the jar in Rachel's hands. After a heartfelt farewell, Elias and Rachel resumed their solitary path. The silence of the road gave them time for reflection. They felt like a glimpse of home, didn't they? Rachel said, glancing at Elias. Yes. Maybe God placed them in our path to remind us we're not alone. Later that day, a storm rolled in quickly. The sky darkened, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Elias urged the horses forward, trying to find shelter before the rain arrived, but the storm caught up with them. Heavy raindrops fell, turning the path to slippery mud. Rachel gripped the wagon bench tightly as the wind whipped her shawl away. Elias shouted commands to the horses, struggling to maintain control. Suddenly, one of the wagon wheels sank into a hidden rut. Stop, Elias! Rachel yelled, panic in her voice. Elias jumped down, battling the wind and rain to inspect the damage. The wheel was stuck deep, and the horses were restless, neighing anxiously. Rachel climbed down, ignoring the sharp pain in her back. What can we do? She asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Elias looked at her, his face wet and worried. We need to pray, Rachel. Only God can get us through this. Together, they knelt in the mud, holding hands as rain poured around them. Elias prayed aloud, asking for strength and guidance. When they rose, he made a decision. I'll try to pull the wheel free with the horses. I need you to hold the lantern so I can see. With great effort and determination, Elias managed to free the wheel, Rachel's lantern lighting the way. As the storm began to subside, a faint light appeared in the distance, a cabin nestled among the trees. Elias, look! Rachel exclaimed, pointing toward it. Exhausted, they guided the wagon toward the shelter. Inside, they were greeted by a farming family who welcomed them with warm words and a hot meal. As they dried off by the fire, Rachel reflected on how, even in hardship, God continued to provide. I never thought a storm could lead us to safety, she said, looking at Elias. He smiled, taking her hand. God does the same with our lives, Rachel. Sometimes, He uses the storm to guide us exactly where we need to be. The warm glow of the fireplace in the farmer's cabin felt like a blessing after the storm. Rachel and Elias sat at the simple wooden table as the lady of the house, a kind woman named Martha, served them steaming bowls of potato soup. Beside her was her husband, Thomas, a man of few words but generous gestures. "You're brave to face the trail like this," Martha said as she set down a loaf of homemade bread. "It's no easy journey, especially for a young mother-to-be." Rachel offered a shy smile, her hand resting on her growing belly as she expressed her gratitude for the meal. Despite the hospitality, a heaviness lingered in her heart. The journey had been harder than she'd anticipated, and the weariness was beginning to chip away at her strength. That night, as they rested in the cabin's attic, Elias took her hand. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked, echoing a question he had asked before, but with deeper concern in his eyes now. Rachel sighed. "Not second thoughts, Elias. But, sometimes I wonder if we were too hasty. What if I'm not strong enough for what lies ahead?" Elias didn't answer right away. He leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. "You don't have to be strong alone, Rachel. God is our strength. He's brought us this far, and He won't abandon us now." His words settled in Rachel's heart, though lingering doubts still shadowed her thoughts. The next morning, they bid farewell to Martha and Thomas with warm embraces and blessings. The road ahead was firmer now, but the emotional challenges loomed larger. Rachel moved more slowly, her body aching, and the wagon's food supplies were beginning to run low. On the fourth day after leaving the cabin, something unexpected happened. Elias stopped the horses abruptly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Rachel followed his line of sight and saw a figure approaching. It was a man in a small cart pulled by a donkey. As the figure came closer, Rachel recognized Silas, the merchant they had met days earlier. He raised a hand in greeting. "Elias." "Rachel. What a surprise to see you here." Silas seemed friendly, but there was a weariness in his face, as if the trail had taken a toll on him as well. After exchanging a few words, Silas explained that he had lost part of his goods during a rough crossing and was heading to the next village to restock. "I don't have much left," he said, opening a small cloth bag containing hard biscuits and packets of dried herbs, "but perhaps these might help." Elias hesitated, aware of their dwindling provisions, but Rachel stepped in. "Take them, Elias. Silas needs help too, and we can share what we have." Rachel's generosity brought a smile to Silas's face and gave Elias a moment of pause. He was used to being the provider, but this reminded him of the importance of trusting not just his strength, but the support of others. The following days brought a new trial for the couple. As they crossed a dry plain under an oppressive heat, Rachel began to feel frequent bouts of dizziness. Her condition worried Elias, but Rachel refused to stop. "We can't stop now, Elias. Every day we delay puts us further from our home." "But your health matters more than any destination," he countered, gripping her hand firmly. The greatest test came on a particularly quiet night. Rachel woke up with sharp pain in her abdomen. At first, she tried to ignore it, dismissing it as fatigue, but the pain quickly intensified. "Elias," she called, her voice trembling with fear. Elias was by her side in an instant. Seeing the panic in her eyes, he reached for his Bible and began praying aloud, pleading with God to protect Rachel and the baby. As he prayed, Rachel's pain began to subside, replaced by a surprising sense of peace. Though still weak, she felt comforted by Elias's words and the reassurance that they were not facing this trial alone. The next morning, Elias made a decision. "We're going to find a pastor or a doctor in the next village, Rachel. We can't continue like this without help." Though hesitant at first, Rachel agreed. It was a humbling reminder that faith didn't mean facing everything alone but trusting that God would send help when needed. The journey to the nearest village took 2 days. When they finally arrived, they were welcomed by a man named Pastor James, who led a small congregation in the area. He greeted them with open arms, listening to their story with compassion and offering prayers for their strength. God places us in specific places for specific reasons, the pastor said, his kind eyes meeting Rachel's. Sometimes, trials aren't signs of weakness but opportunities to grow in his grace. The pastor's kindness and wisdom renewed Rachel and Elias's confidence. As they rested in the village, Rachel reflected on how, even in the face of hardship, God had been providing for their every need. The sound of wagon wheels once again echoed along the dusty trail as Rachel and Elias resumed their journey, now renewed by the hospitality of the small village. Pastor James had prayed for them as they departed, and his words lingered in Rachel's heart. God always lights the path, even when it feels like we're walking in the dark. The sun was high when Elias finally spotted the land he had dreamed of. He stopped the horses and pointed with excitement. "There it is, Rachel. Our new home." Rachel leaned forward, wiping the sweat from her brow as she looked toward where Elias gestured. The sight before them was unexpected. Instead of the rolling green hills and fertile soil Elias had envisioned, they were met with an arid field of cracked, hardened earth dotted with sparse, dry trees and scattered bushes. Elias climbed down from the wagon, his expression a mixture of determination and hesitation. Rachel remained seated for a moment, taking in the reality of their destination. "This is it?" she asked softly, trying to hide her disappointment. Elias nodded. "Yes. The agent assured me the land was good. Maybe it just needs some work." Rachel carefully stepped down, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The heat felt more intense here, and the wind carried fine dust that clung to her skin. "Elias," she began, but her voice faltered. He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Rachel, I know it's not what we expected. But God brought us here for a reason. He's called us to build something out of nothing." Rachel wanted to believe him, but doubt loomed like a dark cloud in her mind. The days that followed were spent starting from scratch. Elias built a simple cabin using the wood they had brought, while Rachel organized their few belongings. The work was grueling, and the relentless heat offered no reprieve. One morning, as Elias dug to prepare the soil for planting, he hit stone after stone buried in the ground. Each strike of the spade felt like a cruel reminder of the land's stubborn infertility. From the shade of the cabin, Rachel watched him, guilt gnawing at her for the frustration she felt growing inside. She knew Elias bore the weight of their decision, but her own faith felt fragile under the strain. "Why did God bring us here, Elias?" she asked that evening as they shared a modest meal of bread and soup. He looked at her, his eyes weary but filled with quiet resolve. "Maybe to teach us to trust him, even when everything feels impossible." Rachel didn't reply, but a silent battle raged in her heart. On the third day, as Elias continued to wrestle with the unyielding soil, Rachel decided to explore their surroundings. Walking slowly across the property, she noticed a narrow path in the distance, winding toward a cluster of trees. Curious, she followed it and discovered a small stream of clear water tucked away in the dry landscape. Her heart swelled with hope. It was a reminder that even in the most barren places, God provides what is needed. Rachel hurried back to the cabin, calling out to Elias. "Elias! There's a stream. There's water." He dropped his spade and followed her to the site. When they reached the stream, Elias knelt down and cupped the cool water in his hands, a smile breaking through his tired face for the first time in days. "It's a miracle, Rachel. God hasn't abandoned us." With the stream as their water source, Elias began setting up a rudimentary irrigation system. The soil, though stubborn, began to yield under his persistent care. While Elias worked in the fields, Rachel focused on turning their cabin into a modest but welcoming home. Challenges still arose. One afternoon, as Elias worked, he noticed footprints around the perimeter of their property. When he returned to the cabin, his face was tense. "Is something wrong?" Rachel asked. I think we're not alone out here. Could be animals, or people. The possibility of danger hung over them like a shadow, but Elias remained steadfast, reinforcing the cabin and keeping his rifle close. That night, under a sky full of stars, Rachel sat at the cabin's doorway, her hands resting protectively over her unborn child. "It's not what I imagined," she said aloud, knowing Elias could hear her as he sat nearby. "But maybe it's exactly where we're supposed to be." He pulled her close, his eyes fixed on the heavens. "One day, Rachel, we'll look back on this and see how much God blessed us, even when we couldn't understand it." For the first time in weeks, Rachel smiled, a small yet profound sense of hope taking root in her heart. The morning dawned golden over the arid land, bringing renewed energy to Rachel and Elias. The small stream Rachel had discovered had become a source of hope, turning the dream of cultivating the land into something tangible. The work was relentless, but it now carried a sense of purpose. Elias rose before sunrise each day, sharpening tools and planning how to irrigate the land. Rachel, despite her pregnancy, refused to rest for long. She kept the cabin organized, prepared meals, and often walked to the stream to fetch fresh water. "Elias, do you think the land will give in?" Rachel asked one afternoon as she helped hang freshly washed clothes. "It doesn't have a choice," Elias replied with a tired but confident smile. "It's like us. It might be hard at first, but with time, it will flourish." Elias spoke with faith, but the difficulties remained. One day, while plowing a small patch of soil, he unearthed something unexpected, a broken arrow. He held it carefully, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Rachel asked, noticing his reaction. "This land must have been a battleground once. We don't know who might show up here." A chill ran down Rachel's spine, but she placed a reassuring hand on Elias's arm. "God brought us here, Elias. He'll protect us, just as he has so far." A few days later, as Rachel was preparing a simple meal, she noticed two figures approaching along the trail. She called for Elias, who quickly ran to the cabin door, rifle in hand. "Who are you?" Elias called out, his voice firm but not hostile. The figures stopped at a safe distance. It was a man and a woman. The man looked worn, his clothes tattered and his face weary. The woman, walking beside him, held a basket of dried fruit. "We're neighbors," the man said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "My name's Samuel, and this is my wife, Anna. We live north of here. We saw the smoke from your fire and wanted to meet you." Elias lowered the rifle, and Rachel stepped forward, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. "It's good to know we're not alone out here," Rachel said, her voice warm and welcoming. Anna smiled and extended the basket. "We brought this as a welcome gift. We know what it's like to start from scratch." Elias and Rachel accepted the gift gratefully, and soon the four of them were gathered around an improvised fire, sharing stories. Samuel and Anna explained that they were also pioneers who had faced countless challenges establishing their small farm. "The beginning is always the hardest," Anna said, looking at Rachel. "But faith and hard work always bear fruit." Rachel felt an instant connection with Anna, and the two women began exchanging experiences. Meanwhile, Elias listened intently as Samuel shared insights about the land, warning about predators and unpredictable weather. "What about others?" Elias asked. "Are there more people around here?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "Not many. But those who live here have their reasons. Just be cautious, not everyone is friendly." His words hung in the air, but Elias and Rachel decided not to press further. In the days that followed, Samuel and Anna returned to visit, bringing seeds and advice on how to prepare the soil. With their help, Elias planted the first crops near the stream. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Rachel, too, began feeling more at home. Anna taught her how to use local herbs to make teas and simple remedies, which helped ease the aches from her pregnancy. One afternoon, as Elias worked on building a fence around the garden, he paused to watch Rachel near the cabin. The wind caught her hair, and she looked stronger and more determined than ever. "You're the bravest woman I know," he said, walking toward her with a smile. Rachel laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "If that's true, Elias, it's because I've learned it from you." They shared a knowing glance, a moment of unspoken connection. In that instant, it felt like they could face any challenge as long as they were together. That night, before going to bed, Rachel and Elias sat by the fire, gazing at the star-filled sky. "Elias, I feel like we've started to build something here. It's not just a house or a farm, it's a life." "It's more than that, Rachel. It's a testament. A reminder that God calls us to be light, even in the most difficult places." As the fire crackled softly, they bowed their heads in silent prayer, giving thanks for every small victory. The challenges weren't over, but they knew their future was in God's hands. The warm wind swept over the newly planted fields, stirring small clouds of dust that settled in a fine, gritty layer over everything. Elias and Rachel had worked tirelessly in recent weeks, carefully irrigating the soil with water from the stream and tending to the seedlings with their limited resources. It was slow, grueling work, but every tiny green sprout breaking through the earth felt like a promise. Rachel, now in the final stages of her pregnancy, spent most of her time near the cabin, limiting herself to lighter tasks. Still, she insisted on helping Elias whenever she could, bringing him water or preparing simple meals to keep him going. "It looks like the plants are finally taking hold," Elias remarked one afternoon as he knelt to examine the seedlings. Rachel smiled from her makeshift bench near the fence. "God has been faithful, Elias. Each little sprout is a reminder of that." But the calm didn't last. That evening, as they ate dinner by lamplight, Rachel heard an unusual noise outside. It was a low, growing hum that seemed to be getting closer. "Elias, do you hear that?" she asked, her heart beginning to race. Elias set down his spoon and walked to the door. When he opened it, his face turned pale. "Locusts," he muttered. Rachel hurried to his side and saw what he was staring at. A massive swarm of locusts was approaching, darkening the sky like a storm cloud. The droning hum grew louder, and Rachel's chest tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. "Elias, what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He grasped her hand firmly. "We're going to pray." The swarm descended swiftly, consuming the fields with terrifying voracity. The plants they had labored over for weeks were devoured before their eyes. Elias grabbed a piece of cloth and waved it desperately, trying to fend off the insects, but it was futile. The locusts seemed endless, and every effort to stop them only underscored their helplessness. Rachel knelt near the cabin's entrance, praying fervently. "Lord, we trust in you. We know nothing happens without your will. Help us, Father. Show us your purpose, even in this trial." As she prayed, Elias paused, the cloth still in his hand. He looked at Rachel and felt an unexpected calm wash over him. The wind, once hot and unrelenting, began to shift. A cool breeze stirred, and in the distance, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. "Rachel," he called, his voice filled with a new sense of hope. Rachel lifted her face and saw what he did. The clouds were moving swiftly, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. Within minutes, the first raindrop fell, followed by a downpour so strong it felt like it had been sent straight from heaven. The locusts began to scatter, unable to withstand the driving rain. Rachel and Elias stood in the downpour, drenched, watching the miracle unfold before them. Elias, it feels like God is protecting us, Rachel said, tears mixing with the rain. He nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. He always has, Rachel. Even when we couldn't see it. The next morning, as the sun rose, Elias went to the fields to assess the damage. While some plants had been destroyed, most had survived. What had seemed like total loss now stood as a powerful reminder of God's grace. Rachel, sitting on the cabin's porch, watched Elias at work. The baby stirred within her, and she felt a deep sense of peace. "We'll rebuild what was lost," Elias said as he walked back to her. "Not because we're strong, but because he is strong in us." Rachel smiled, taking his hand. "And we'll harvest the blessings he has prepared for us, Elias. Because this land, with all its trials, is a testament to his faithfulness." They sat together, gazing at the field that, despite its scars, still held life. The gentle sound of the stream in the background was like a song of hope, and the clear, blue sky overhead felt like a promise of better days to come. The first light of dawn illuminated the field, still damp from the recent rain. The earthy scent of wet soil filled the air, carrying a sense of renewal and peace. Rachel woke early that morning, the weight of her pregnancy making each movement slow and deliberate. It won't be long now," she murmured to herself, a tired but hopeful smile on her lips. Elias was already outside, inspecting the field. Despite the damage from the locusts, the surviving plants were thriving, as if the miracle of the rain had breathed new life into the land. Rachel watched him from the cabin window, pride and gratitude swelling in her heart. When he came back inside, his face was sweaty, but his grin was wide. "Some of the seedlings are even bigger than before," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Rachel smiled, but the expression quickly gave way to a wince as a stronger contraction rippled through her. "Rachel?" Elias rushed to her side, steadying her by the shoulders. "I'm fine," she replied, taking a deep breath. "I think the baby's just letting me know it won't be long now." Elias fell silent for a moment, his eyes filled with concern. "I'll go get Anna. She said she'd help when it was time." Rachel nodded, squeezing his hand. "Go, but don't take too long." Anna arrived by midday, accompanied by Samuel, who brought extra firewood and a bundle of herbs. With the calm efficiency of a seasoned midwife, Anna quickly took charge, organizing everything for the delivery. "Don't worry, Rachel. Women have been doing this since the dawn of time, and you're strong," Anna said with an encouraging smile. Rachel tried to laugh, but the pain of the contractions was becoming more intense. Elias, though visibly nervous, stayed by her side, holding her hand and whispering words of reassurance. "We're in this together, Rachel. Always together." The hours passed slowly, each one testing Rachel's physical and emotional limits. As she struggled with the pain, doubts crept into her mind. She thought of the hardships they had endured, the moments when her faith had faltered, and she wondered if she was truly ready to be a mother in such a rugged and challenging place. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered through tears. Anna, sensing her struggle, placed a comforting hand on Rachel's shoulder. "He's with you, Rachel. And very soon, you'll be holding the greatest blessing of all." Those words rekindled something in Rachel's heart. She gripped Elias's hand tightly and, with one final push, heard the sound that changed everything, the loud, healthy cry of a baby. "It's a boy!" Anna exclaimed, wrapping the newborn in a soft blanket. Relief and joy washed over Rachel as she began to sob, overwhelmed by the moment. Elias was speechless, his eyes fixed on the tiny miracle now in his arms. "He's perfect," Rachel whispered, cradling the baby to her chest. Elias knelt beside the bed, placing his hand gently on his son's head. "Lord, thank you for this life. We promise to raise him in your ways, so he will grow to know your love and faithfulness." In the days that followed, the cabin buzzed with new energy. The cries of their newborn son, whom they named Caleb, filled the simple walls with a joy Rachel and Elias had never known before. Neighbors came to visit, bringing small gifts and sharing in the couple's happiness. Anna, holding Caleb in her arms, turned to Rachel with a warm smile. "You're stronger than you think, Rachel. You always have been." Rachel smiled back, taking Anna's hand in hers. "I think God wanted to teach me that through everything we've been through." One night, as Caleb slept soundly in a small basket beside the bed, Elias and Rachel sat together on the cabin porch. The moonlight bathed the recovering fields, where the plants were beginning to stand tall once again. "I never thought a place so simple could feel so full of life," Rachel said, resting her head on Elias's shoulder. "It's not the place, Rachel. It's God. He's transforming everything, starting with us," Elias replied. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the gentle sound of the stream in the distance and the soft breathing of their son. "Our journey is only just beginning, Elias," Rachel said, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "And I can't wait to see what's ahead," Elias replied, squeezing her hand. In that moment, the challenges and uncertainties seemed small compared to the certainty that God was guiding their every step. The days at the small cabin had settled into a rhythm filled with purpose and gratitude. Each morning, Elias tended to the crops, which, despite their initial struggles, were now showing signs of strength and life. Rachel split her time between caring for little Caleb and keeping the home organized. The cabin, now adorned with handmade curtains, jars of dried flowers, and a small corner dedicated to an open Bible turned to the Psalms, felt more like a sanctuary than ever. The tranquility was interrupted one afternoon when a familiar figure appeared on the trail leading to the cabin. It was Silas, the merchant they had met weeks earlier. His face was thinner, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, and his clothes bore the dust of many roads. Elias noticed him first, standing near the fence. Dropping his tools, he approached Silas and extended a hand. "Silas? Is everything all right?" The man hesitated, as if weighed down by an unseen burden, before replying in a hoarse voice. "I need a place to stay. Just for the night," he said. "I'm running from something." Rachel, watching from the porch with Caleb in her arms, felt a chill run down her spine. Silas looked different from the confident merchant they had first met. His eyes carried a mix of desperation and shame. Elias glanced back at Rachel, who gave him a subtle nod. "Come inside, Silas. We'll take care of you," Elias said. Tea on the edge of the bed, feeling the baby moving vigorously within her and the occasional sharp twinges that reminded her the time was near. That evening, as Silas ate at their simple wooden table, Rachel and Elias listened to his story. "I wasn't always a merchant," he began, his voice heavy. "I once had land, a family, but I lost everything. I made bad choices, betrayed the trust of those I loved, and I walked away from God." Rachel felt a knot tighten in her chest. There was something deeply human and familiar about Silas's vulnerability. "And now?" Elias asked. "What are you looking for?" Silas lowered his gaze, his voice barely audible. "Redemption. But I don't know if it's possible." The room fell silent for a moment. Rachel reached out and placed her hand over Silas's, her eyes filled with compassion. "We all lose our way at some point, Silas. But God never stops calling us back." Elias nodded, picking up his Bible. Flipping to Luke 15, he began to read aloud. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home." When Elias finished, Silas's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He looked at them, his voice trembling. "Do you really believe God could still take me back?" Rachel's soft smile held no doubt. "He never stopped waiting for you, Silas." The next day, Elias and Silas worked together in the fields. As they dug and cleared the ground, Silas opened up more about his past. He spoke of failed business ventures, mounting debts, and the shame of having let his family down. "I ran because I didn't know how to fix things," he admitted, staring at the dirt beneath his feet. Elias paused, leaning on his shovel. "Running doesn't change the past, Silas. But facing it with God by your side can transform your future." Silas seemed to consider these words deeply, and something about his demeanor shifted. For the first time, his eyes lifted toward the horizon with a hint of hope. That evening, before Silas prepared to leave, Rachel and Elias insisted he stay for dinner. After the meal, Silas asked if he could pray with them. His prayer was brief but raw with sincerity. "Lord, I'm lost, but I want to find my way back to you. Show me how to start over." When he finished, the room was quiet, the weight of his honesty filling the space. "You've already taken the first step, Silas," Rachel said softly. The following morning, Silas readied himself to depart. Though his journey was far from over, he carried himself with a lighter spirit. Before leaving, he handed Elias a small leather pouch. "Inside are a few coins and some seeds I've carried with me. I want you to have them. It's not much, but it's all I can give." Elias hesitated, but Silas pressed the pouch into his hands. "You've given me something far greater, hope." Rachel, cradling Caleb in her arms, waved as Silas disappeared down the trail, setting out on a new path. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias and Rachel sat on the porch together. "Do you think Silas will find what he's looking for?" Rachel asked, her gaze fixed on the fading light. Elias wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think he already has. Now it's just a matter of him realizing it." Rachel nodded, a deep peace settling over her. God always finds us, no matter how far we've wandered. As the sky transitioned from blue to golden, Rachel felt a renewed sense of gratitude. God wasn't just rebuilding their lives, He was using them to touch others along the way. The months passed swiftly, bringing with them the sweet aroma of change and growth. The crops that Elias and Rachel had nurtured with such care had flourished, painting the once barren land in vibrant shades of green. The sight filled their hearts with joy, as if the earth itself was celebrating alongside them. Caleb, now a few months old, had become the soul of their little home. His laughter echoed through the cabin like a heavenly melody, infusing even the most tiring days with joy. As Rachel rocked him in her arms, she felt deeply connected to the land that had once seemed so unforgiving. Now, it stood as a symbol of perseverance and grace. "He'll grow up seeing God's promises fulfilled," she said one morning, watching Elias harvest the first vegetables from the field. "Not just seeing," Elias replied with a grin, "but living them. He's one of those promises." The community around their homestead began to grow as well. Samuel and Anna were frequent visitors, lending their hands in the fields and sharing simple meals. Other pioneers, drawn by stories of faith and the warmth of Rachel and Elias's hospitality, began to gather. One afternoon, while working in the field, Samuel shared an idea. "Have you thought about hosting a service here? A place where we can gather to thank God for everything He's done?" Elias glanced at Rachel, who was holding Caleb and smiling in agreement. "Let's do it. This land is more than our home, it's a testament." The following Sunday, under a clear and sunny sky, Rachel and Elias prepared a simple space near the stream for the service. They used logs for benches and decorated the area with wildflowers that Rachel and Anna had gathered. Slowly, neighbors arrived, bringing dishes of food and simple musical instruments. The sound of voices singing hymns filled the air, a symphony of praise and gratitude that echoed across the fields. Holding his Bible, Elias shared a heartfelt testimony. "When we first arrived, everything felt impossible. The land was hard, the path was full of stones, and the future seemed uncertain. But we've learned that God doesn't call us to easy places. He calls us to places where His strength can be revealed through our weakness." Rachel, her eyes glistening with tears, held Elias's hand as he continued. "Every plant that grows in this field, every laugh from our son, is proof of God's faithfulness. No matter how hard the journey, He is always with us." The service ended with prayers and warm embraces. As Rachel watched the neighbors depart, her heart overflowed. What had begun as an uncertain dream was now a blessed reality. That evening, as the sun set, Elias and Rachel sat on the porch, watching the shadows of the hills dance in the twilight. Caleb slept peacefully in his cradle, and the silence was filled with the gentle sounds of the stream and the wind rustling through the trees. "Do you remember how it all started, Rachel?" Elias asked, breaking the quiet. "I do," she replied with a smile, her gaze soft. "I remember the fear, the doubt, and how God carried us through every step." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We have everything we need here. It's not just the land or the crops, it's peace. It's purpose." Rachel took his hand, and they sat quietly, their hearts full of gratitude for all that God had done. Elias rose and walked to a young tree he had planted weeks before. He touched its fragile trunk, now firmly rooted in the fertile soil. "This place will grow with us, Rachel. It'll be a home for Caleb, for those who come after him, and for everyone God brings into our lives." Rachel watched him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "And God will be here, just as He's always been." Under the starlit sky, Elias and Rachel prayed together, dedicating once again all they were and all they had to their Creator. On that day, they realized that the true harvest wasn't just what they planted in the fields, it was what God had cultivated in their hearts: faith, love, and an eternal purpose. Years passed, quiet but abundant with blessings. The small cabin that Elias and Rachel had built with their own hands was now surrounded by fields brimming with life. The once hard and barren soil had become fertile, thanks to Elias's tireless labor and God's unceasing provision. Caleb, now 5 years old, darted across the fields with boundless energy, his light brown hair glinting in the morning sun. Rachel watched him from the porch, one hand resting on her rounded belly. Soon, another life would join their family. "Don't go too far, Caleb," she called, laughing as he waved back, his bare feet kicking up small puffs of dust. Elias emerged from the side of the cabin, carrying a bucket of fresh water. He smiled at the sight of Rachel cradling her growing belly. "I think he's going to be like you," Rachel said with a soft laugh. "Always exploring, always dreaming." Elias set the bucket down and sat beside her, his gaze sweeping over the fields. "And that's why we're here, Rachel. So he, and the ones to come, have a place to grow and dream." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "It feels like yesterday that it all began. The fear, the doubts, but look at where God has brought us." Elias squeezed her hand gently. "And He's not finished yet." Later that day, neighbors began to arrive, some carrying baskets of fruit, others with musical instruments. Samuel and Anna were the first to come, bringing along a group of children who quickly joined Caleb in his games. "Ready for another service?" Samuel asked, shaking Elias's hand. "Always. There's no better way to thank him for everything he's done." The service took place under the shade of trees Elias had planted years before, now tall and sturdy. The sound of hymns and laughter filled the air, and Rachel felt a deep peace as she held Caleb's hand. He sat quietly beside her, listening intently. When Elias began to speak, his voice carried a quiet strength, thick with emotion. When we came here, this place was nothing but dry, hard soil. But God taught us that with faith, hard work, and trust in His promises, even the most barren ground can bear fruit. What we see here today isn't our work, it's His. Rachel looked around at the faces in the gathering, faces that were once strangers but had become family. Their small community had grown, as had the love they shared for one another. By evening, when the last of the neighbors had left, Rachel and Elias sat on the porch once more, watching the sky glow golden in the fading sunlight. "Do you think Caleb will remember all this when he's older?" Rachel asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Elias turned to her, a peaceful smile on his face. "He'll remember. Not just the moments, but what they mean. He'll remember that God never fails, that His faithfulness is without end." Rachel smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "And when he asks why we worked so hard, what will we say?" Elias looked out at the fields, now blanketed in golden wheat, and replied, "We'll tell him it was worth it, Rachel. Every effort, every tear, every prayer was a seed that God turned into something greater." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first star appeared in the sky, Rachel and Elias sat side by side, thankful for what they had built, not just a house or a farm, but a life rooted in faith and the unfailing love of God. What did you think of Elias and Rachel's story? Have you ever faced challenges that seemed impossible, only to see God work in miraculous ways? Share your experience in the comments. We'd love to hear your story of faith and overcoming. If you enjoyed this uplifting narrative, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. This is the Narratives That Embrace channel. Stay with God, and we'll see you in the next story.